Thank you, Ann. We could have let you guys eat a little bit longer. But I'm sure Chris can make up for any shortness in the current schedule with great ease. So without further ado, let me introduce Chris. Chris is a group leader for the Safeguards and Security Technology Group out of the laboratory. And I have his bio here, about 14 pages. Let me summarize. He's worked at the lab since 1980. His expertise, as I mentioned, is in radiation measurements as applied to safeguard security, other sorts of things for monitoring and controlling nuclear material. He has won several DOE awards. He has 2 patents. Congratulations. Has served on DOE task force, has authored over 140 technical papers and presentations on safeguards monitoring, and is extraordinarily active in both the local and national INMM organization. So, Chris.
Thank you, Howard. And you know, I had no idea 15 years later I'd end up on a train in the middle of Russia heading to one of their secret sites. So I mean, whatever you see now in terms of what the future might be, I can guarantee it's going to be hard to predict. And wherever your careers are going to go, if you had to sit down today and say, this is my plan, I guarantee the plan will change on you one way or another. And maybe in a lot of ways that I think will be a pleasant surprise for you. So with that, I got the wrong message. I got the agenda late. I didn't know I was supposed to talk about the future of INMM. I got this letter, can you replace Larry Statkoviak and talk about the future of safeguards and security? So that's what my presentation is, but I'll be happy to talk about INMM later if anybody wants to talk about it. It's hard really to talk about the past without going into, or talk about the future without mentioning the past. And a lot of our speakers have covered some of that, but I'm going to go over a few things that are pertinent to my talk. But if we look at the future and where we'd like to be and where we are now and where we've been, we can start to maybe see what challenges are still left out there. So I'm going to start talking about the MPT in the 21st century. And also I got a list of some of the justifications of why countries and states consider to go nuclear. And then I'll talk about some of the current emerging challenges, and then we'll focus on a couple of them for time's sake, and then I'll try to engage you in some of the future challenges. But if you look at the post-Cold War era, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there have been like 3 major themes that have come out for nuclear security. Eliminate the loose nukes. Of course, this is how we got engaged with Russia and the former Soviet countries. You know, a lot of us that were working in the weapons program or domestic safeguards or international safeguards, all of a sudden we found there weren't enough of us to cover what was going on in Russia. They needed physical security upgrades. They weren't doing MCNA or material control and accounting the way we do it. They were basically had a 1950s paper ledger system in place. And a lot of their safeguards, as we would call it, was based on the fact they were still in closed cities. So the physical protection systems at their cities are what they took credit for ensuring that nuclear material was still where it was and in the amounts they thought it was in. Then one of the other things that came out in the post-Cold War era was preventing new nuclear weapons states. Now, I don't think this one was new, but it was emphasized or re-emphasized again. And then another one, as I think was mentioned previously, was the monitoring and controlling of global capabilities. We kind of refer to this as export control. But a lot of these agreements were upgraded and reworked in the 90s. Now, we did have some success. I think one of our previous speakers talked about U.S.-Russian material. I think Ray mentioned that this morning. The program was called Megatons to Megawatts. Almost 12,000 material equivalent to 12,000 nuclear warheads was blended down, and it's being burned here in reactors in TVA. Very good program. I think it's ended now. Is that right, Morris? Next program I mentioned was the MPCNA program. Now, this was a program that I was heavily involved in different aspects. As a monitor, I'd go over and monitor things that were blended down. Also, in the U.S. would pay them for that under material control conversion. There was another program I'll mention, HEU Transparency, that recently ended. But this shows how we did upgrades at a lot of these sites in Russia. We got there in the early mid-90s and things were really destitute. I mean, their economy had collapsed. I'm gonna tell some stories since I got a little extra time, but Mikhail Gorbachev, as many of you probably know, was the Russian president or the last Soviet leader, we probably should say. And there was a coup that was taken over, but when he became president and did perestroika and tried to open things up, what he was trying to find, he realized that the Russian people weren't living as well as the rest of the world. And he wanted to know why. Well, he started to say, what are we spending on our military-industrial complex? And this was not just the nuclear programs, this was chem bio, this was everything, tanks, guns. Well, it turns out it was a state secret. It was such a state secret that even Gorbachev could not find out. No one person in the Soviet Union seemed to know how much money was being spent. The estimates range as high as 25% of their GDP, which we were spending less than 5%, and that was under the Reagan buildup of the 80s. Now, the other thing that we saw at these sites and some of the concerns, many of you from Georgia know about Senator Nunn and Senator Lugar. Fortunately, they were in the right position to have had a plan in place. The Soviet Union collapsed a lot faster than most of us thought could ever happen. When it did collapse, there weren't enough Americans and technical experts to we were forming teams rapidly to get over there to help based on the Nunn-Lugar program. But what had happened is Reagan and Gorbachev were kind of buddies, as probably most people. They really clicked, a lot of chemistry there. George the First, I'll call him, became president. Reagan was ending. George the First didn't have the same relationship with Gorbachev and the Soviets. He came from being a CIA director, and it was a little harder for him to warm up to the Russians right away. But things started happening quickly, and Secretary of State James Baker, I believe, was the one that's probably credited for it, but he says, when the Soviet Union collapsed, he says, who has control of the nukes? So there were a lot of nuclear material in a lot of places. Some of the rescue missions, as we called them, to go recover material overseas that Ray mentioned, they just got accelerated and started in this time period. But things have changed a lot. We've been doing this since about 1994-ish, and we recently, the agreement was kind of updated, and I think it ends now in 2018, but there's a lot less access for us to some of these sites right now. I went to the Arsma 16 site, was the first site I went to. This was called the Los Alamos of Russia. The previous visit, I told some people earlier, the previous visit had some VIPs that went, senators, our weapons labs director, Sig Hecker from Los Alamos, director of Livermore. Before my visit, the director of Livermore provided the Soviets at the time, I guess, or Russians, with a satellite map of their facility. Now, this city was not on any map. This city, like our Manhattan Project cities, was still a closed city. Russians didn't leave or go out of this city without special papers. Now, how large do you think this city was? I said Oak Ridge in its heyday was 75,000 people. This city was over 100,000. in a closed city in the middle of Russia, and people didn't leave. Now, the people there felt protected, that's what they told me. We would feel like our freedom to go and visit was being restricted, but they felt protected being in that city. But in there, they took us into this museum because this museum was off limits. And this museum actually had a tabletop model of their whole site. And because the director of Livermore gave them a satellite map showing them what their site looked like from space, they assumed every American had access to it, so it was now okay for us to go into the facility. And in that facility, as Ray mentioned, was a model of every weapon they made at that site. And the first one was Fat Man. Now, Fat Man looked verbatim like the one I've seen in the Los Alamos Museum, except maybe the color of paint. It was introduced to us based on Los Alamos design, but with Russian improvements. Now, you know, we're scratching our heads. Well, it is gray instead of red or whatever, or the color was out at their museum. But I found out from Sig Hecker when he was here, because I learned after that visit that Sig, who was the director of Los Alamos, asked the director of ours in 16, he goes, so if you made a weapon based on Los Alamos design, why in 49 did you test our weapon and not your design, which had the Russian improvements? His comment back to Sig was, things being what they were, we knew yours would work. What he meant was Stalin would have my head had this test not went off. Now, this was kind of a shock to the American political system at the time. I'm going to give you at the end of this some books to read where some of this information, I actually verified it. But after World War II, Truman and Groves basically believed uranium was this rare element. It was rarer than gold, and the U.S. Military and government got control of a mine in the Congo, which had belonged to the Belgians. And basically, in 45, they were high-fiving each other in the White House, saying, you know, we've got all the uranium, no one else will get it. So in 49, when the Russians detonated their device, you can imagine the shock in the U.S. political and military community. And so for us to go to these sites where some of that history had begun, it was quite an experience for me and some of my team members in that time frame. This has been a very successful program, and a lot has been accomplished with it. And right now it's kind of in a state of winding down, but the access, there's still some engagement, but the access has been much restricted from what we had early on. The cooperative threat reduction, this Ray, was also a successful program in the post-Cold War era. This is where we got material out of countries. The first project they referred to as Sapphire, where a lot of material was brought to Y-12 from Project Sapphire. They also got centrifuge parts from Libya as part of this program, and it continues today. Highly enriched uranium transparency program, another post-Cold War era program. This just ended this past year, and quite a bit of material was blended down from this program too. This is in addition to the megatons to megawatts program. Now, what has happened since is there's been programs that have emerged based on what we were doing at the Russian sites. These are the post 9/11 type programs. These programs, basically, we were upgrading at the nuclear sites, which we would call our first line of defense. And then there was some concern in the post 9/11 era about, you know, nuclear materials and devices being shipped into ports in the U.S. from ports overseas. So the second line of defense program sprung up in that time frame. That program exists today. A good part of my group work in this area. But they put portals around the globes at different ports, basically monitoring shipments and things that are transported to make sure at least they can deter any adversary from trying to smuggle nuclear material out of a country or into a country. So where are we at now in terms of the NPT? Well, we got 190 countries that are basically signed up. There's been some things, in 1995, the NPT, you guys, all policy makers probably didn't know this, but it was scheduled to expire after 25 years, and in 1995 they extended it indefinitely. We've strengthened things with what was mentioned by John, the additional protocol. And the Nuclear Suppliers Group, this is a list that's developed for our export control people. They started monitoring in 1992 dual-use materials. But there's still challenges out there. We have still countries not participating, and I think you guys know these are well known. North Korea never became fully compliant and then just said they're done in 2003. There's a lot of, Sig Hecker gave a nice talk on that. But they want some attention, obviously. The good thing about North Korea, at least in some people's eyes, is they're kind of an island of instability and a sea of stability, where Iran is kind of an island of instability and a sea of instability. But Iran is now coming around. Disarmament or arms control, I think, will remain a challenge in this century for your generation to deal with. It just moves so slowly, and it really is going to take some leadership and some political and original thinking to get things moving faster, in my opinion. So when you get a country that wants to get into a weapons program or go nuclear, I looked up several justifications that seem to be pertinent today. Probably the number one one is they feel vulnerable to a very, what they real or perceived threat. Right now we hear South Korea rumbling that they're not sure the U.S. can really defend them, that they are going to investigate the possibility of creating a nuclear program. Now, they've talked about pyroprocessing, whether they go that way or not, who knows. A country may see an emerging threat. They don't want to be vulnerable, you know. The one thing Albert Einstein said when he was going to be the president of Israel, they asked him if he would like to be president. Now, you policymakers probably hate this, but I'm going to say it anyhow. He said, politics are for the moment, but an equation is forever. Now, what really, one way to really interpret that is politics is very dynamic. A lot of these agreements, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Safeguards Agreements that John referred to, these are long-term agreements. But the motivation to cheat is a political thing. It's a political decision not to make nuclear weapons. And the motivation to cheat on any of these agreements can change just with an election. And we've seen it in different places in the world already. Research. A lot of people want to get into research for a variety of reasons. Some are very legitimate, nuclear medicine and that. But sometimes they just want to have a nuclear technical base just in case they feel threatened or the need to go nuclear. But almost every nuclear program today that I see, they either begin with the need for fuel is their justification, or research. Some see it as truly a business opportunity, but a business opportunity means different things. A.Q. Khan obviously saw business opportunity too. But then there's the legitimate needs like to generate electricity because of limited resources. So, you know, for all these things to occur in a non-proliferant way, the appropriate policy has to be in place and negotiations on how to do it. Whether a fuel bank is the answer or whatever, many of you as political scientists and policy people, you're going to be engaged in some very difficult conversations or negotiations if you stay in this field. a lot of challenges on the policy side. Now, arms control, what is it? Well, we talk about non-proliferation and safeguards. That's dealing a lot of times with materials that haven't gotten into a weapon system. Arms control is the other side of it. You already have the material at weapons grade. You already have the delivery systems. You already have the stockpiles. And arms control is a whole different problem than safeguards to some degree. But what makes both safeguards and arms control hard is the need to protect information. If safeguards, I think Jim mentioned about SWOs and everything, if you're monitoring a enrichment facility and you can do anything to calculate efficiency or come up with SWOs or whatever, what do the owners do? They wave this flag and say that's proprietary. Can't monitor that if you can back calculate that. In arms control, they even get even harder. They say everything's secret. I mean, you can't get anything that will reveal design information. So where are we at in arms control? What are the challenges that are going to come up? Well, these are the major arms control agreements that we've had probably in my lifetime, and maybe there'll be a few more, but a lot of these, when you look at them, what have they done? They've reduced some numbers, they've taken some weapons out of service. The Moscow Treaty expired, which was really just an easy agreement to sign because it did not have verification. It was kind of, we're going to take this number out, we're going to take this number out, trust us, you know, shake hands, and, you know. Well, that got replaced with New START, which does have a verification element. The important thing about arms control and safeguards for it to work is you have to implement measures that can build trust. But you also, as my group is a technology developer of some of these systems, we also have to treat everybody like they're an adversary. Because we're going to be putting systems in the home of the adversary for long periods of time, and we got to assure ourselves that they don't mess with them. Now that is so counter to any common sense thing you would ever do. It's like telling all the burglars in your neighborhood that getting them to sign off on the security system you can put in your house. That's what arms control and safeguards gets into. Everything's negotiated, whatever the approach is, whatever the system is that you would use. Now, there's been things called incentives and disincentives. You know, incentives seem to offer things, but as I said before, it's a political decision not to develop nuclear weapons. And these agreements are long, so the political motivations to cheat can change in time. So your approach has to take that into account. Now, disincentives, you know, they've been less effective, although you could say we have a win with Iran right now, because we got a lot of people to work together and agree to do the same thing. But as soon, and these typically are sanctions, export control kinds of things, but if not everybody agrees on the disincentive, it can be very hard to implement. Now, what does an arms control regime look like? Well, first thing is the declaration, okay? I'm going to wheel in my nuclear weapon, and you have to accept it. That's number 2. Okay, I'm saying here's number 1 that I'm declaring. How do you accept it? Okay, let me tell you what the rules of the game are. You can look at it, you can smell it, you can listen to it sometimes, but you can't touch it with anything. How do I know that's a real nuclear device? How do I know that's a weapon? We try to do things that are acceptable, but we have to have more than one tool in our toolbox. Because if I tell the Russians I want to put a detector on this thing and I want to scan it with neutron tomography and get a pure image and picture of everything here, and then I'm assured that's a weapon, what do you think they're going to say? No. So we come up with these things called information barriers. Now, what's an information barrier? Is it I put a black cloth up in front of it, a curtain, and you can measure through the curtain? No, it typically is a piece of software that we put over the data that basically ends up, after we scan it, it says good or bad, pass, fail, accepted, not accepted. Now the problem with that is we know how to do these things, but we have problems in certifying on the information barrier because it's typically a piece of software these days. But there's things in that software that someone could back calculate design information out. And just to let you know how hard this might be and what may or may not be accepted, you probably heard of Geiger-Mueller tubes, right? The old radiation counters. If I put a radiation counter next to a weapon, say a known distance away, and count for a period of time, we know how to basically back calculate something like size and shape information. Now it'll have some uncertainty with it, but that may be too intrusive. But say we figure out a way to accept this, okay? Then we have to track it, okay? Now they roll it out of the room, okay? We put our sticker on it, new start item number 1. They roll it out of the room, they take up our tag, roll it back in, say here's number 2. How do you prevent that from happening? Those are the kind of things we have to deal with. Now we worked a start 3 scenario back in the mid-90s on our systems to see what the most intrusive agreement we could come up with in terms of inspecting things. To this day, we did some of this at our Pantech site in Y12, but to this day, we haven't done any treaty that includes other than the top 3 in arms control. So there's a challenge for you. And now, most of these agreements are bilateral. They could be multilateral, but usually until you get down here to the material phase, both sides are a little hesitant to involve a multilateral group, simply because they had these thoughts, just our spies and their spies, let's not bring in the rest of the world's spies. But this might be where you get the IEA or somebody like that involved. Now, more challenges for the future. Export control. To me, this is the scariest part. How do you do export control in the age of the internet? Here's the plans for a centrifuge enrichment facility. Attach the plan, hit send, it's gone. How do we do this? What tools are we going to need to be able to monitor these kinds of things? What about 3D printers? These are the technology I think are so cool, but they scare me too. That's a dual use item for sure. How are you guys going to be able to make sure the export control issues and the tools that export control monitors need exist? What are we going to do there? Now, research reactors is something I've had some recent interest in. IEA monitors a lot of reactors. I'll talk a little more about this. But they typically focus on HEU-based research reactors. Even LEU-based research reactors can create flux that with the right targets in there in time, you can make plutonium. Now, how much time is enough? And what if that was in the hand of non-state actor? One of the things, all our agreements today, they don't do much at all to deal with non-state actors, which is probably one I should have put at the top. It's at the bottom of this list. But enrichment, there's a fine line between reactor-grade enrichment to going to weapons-grade enrichment. Michael Whitaker spent most of his career looking at concepts and approaches for these types of facilities. But there's new technology out there. Never underestimate new technology and what it can do. You know, everybody looks at the time frame, how long it takes to get a significant quantity of material. Ray talked about Caliatron technology. There was a reason it was abandoned. It wasn't efficient, it was slow, it took how long to get, you know, barely a bucket's worth. You know, technology has made these processes more efficient. Arms control, you know, I went through that, but what about China? You know, they don't talk to us much at all about this. They don't want people to know about their weapons program. But how can we get them to open up more? The IEA, I think one of their big challenges, and they're dealing with this to some degree, John mentioned a few things, but their ability to detect the undeclared. I met with Herman Nachtertz a couple years ago when he was the Director General. He was an inspector under Hans Blitz in Iraq. The IEA was completely blindsided by their ability to be able to detect the undeclared. They were doing what some call prescriptive safeguards. They had a procedure, the nation state declared their inventory of stuff, they go in and checked it, and they didn't declare those other buildings that John showed you on his satellite map. So they didn't look there right away. It was under Gulf War I with the backing of the US military and their allies that we found the smoking gun. We found a weapon design. And it led to things like the additional protocol and such. Now, keeping people engaged in the MPT, you know, another way to say this, we must build more trust. But as long as people feel threatened, you know, what South Korea does, what Japan could do if North Korea gets a little more provocative. Japan has all the capability right now to probably turn on a weapons program at short notice. Will they? Won't they? Who knows? So let's focus on a couple of these challenges. I did a talk on something called continuity of knowledge that I want to share with you, but we'll talk about the research reactor challenge first. Now, in the world of non-proliferation and safeguards, there may be a feeling that research reactors aren't the problem of the moment or the top three, but I want to present this because I see it as a future challenge. Research reactors are known for having fissile material. There's been programs, GTRI, that DOE has launched to recover HEU material from these reactors. Now, I know not all of you understand maybe why HEU or LEU in the reactor means anything. Well, when you have HEU in a reactor, you get a lot more neutron flux. Neutron flux is used when you hit depleted uranium targets or whatever other targets you can make fissile material, like plutonium-239. These research reactors are small compared to power reactors. The IEA currently monitors power levels as one of their monitoring on power reactors. That doesn't sound right, but they monitor the power out of these reactors. Because most reactors are producing electricity, so they stay very stable. So monitoring that power, it shouldn't fluctuate very much. Now, if it fluctuates, it means somebody's doing something in the core. Maybe putting targets in, or they're just not getting the power out. There may be reasons, but by monitoring power, that's pretty effective. They also look at the core. They want to make sure people aren't adding things in it. So power is not done by itself. But in a research reactor, monitoring power really doesn't mean a lot because they power them up when they want to make something in these hot cells where they put the targets in, and then they kind of lower the power level. So the power in a research reactor can go up and down. Now we have one over in Oak Ridge called HIFER. Now it uses HEU because they need the flux. But the other thing, I'm going to skip that. The other thing is in these research reactors, they have beam ports for these neutrons to hit. No one's monitoring beating ports currently, and then no one's monitoring targets going in and out. Now, it may take you a year to get a significant quantity of plutonium using LEU or natural uranium targets. But say, and these research reactors can be relatively small, they can be hidden. I mean, this could be a real challenge, and with all the non-state actors trying supposedly to get their hands on nuclear material, in parallel, you could have an engineering program to support a weapons design while you're making material. So research reactors may be a future challenge for the agency to consider. These are just some of the current practices that I mentioned. Now, I think John mentioned some of these. The 1995, I think he mentioned 1997 on a few of these, John. So roughly in this time frame, these were some additional tools that the IEA was given, so that they can actually look at more aspects in nation states and on fuel cycle activities. And I won't repeat those because I think John covered them very well. But I want to talk to you about continuity of knowledge and the IEA improving their ability to detect the undeclared. Okay? Now, they don't have a lot of tools. If you don't tell them you have a hidden program or a hidden reactor or hidden enrichment facility, I mean, other than these open source information searches that John mentioned, I mean, their tools are somewhat limited. But the IEA for years has described continuity of knowledge. And my colleagues from Sandia and, well, it was Idaho, now it's Purdue University, we looked for the definition of continuity of knowledge, both in arms control references and in safeguards, and no one defined it. So we did. And this is our definition. It is the outcome of a system of data or information regarding an item or activity that is uninterrupted and authentic and provides the IEA with adequate insight to draw definitive conclusions that nuclear material is not being diverted from peaceful purposes. And what we're saying here, it's an outcome, it's not a process. Part of the safeguards process is designed to establish and maintain continuity of knowledge. But what would it take, and why is it important? Well, if you look at things today, and again, John mentioned several of these, the IEA, these are kind of their current tools. They've went from state declarations where they did the traditional or sometimes called prescriptive safeguards. It's where I declare my nuclear materials and inventories to you, and the IEA comes in and verifies. They added the additional protocol, which included environmental sampling and some of these other activities that John covered. But they've also started talking about a state level approach. Now, this makes sense to me for a lot of reasons. Now, I think it's kind of gotten in policy limbo with the agency at the moment, but it probably will raise its head again. But this is where they customize approach based on fuel cycle activities in different regions and nation states, based on a lot of custom approaches and information they have. This is actually makes a lot of sense because the IEA has limited resources and they need to be able to put their resources to where the real monitoring is. But as they evolve and look for ways to establish continuity of knowledge, you have to ask yourself what makes up the knowledge that we have about an operation or a nation state. And in our world, when I look at just an item of stuff, what do I know about that? What knowledge do I have? Well, my knowledge of it at the moment is based on some prior knowledge. It may be an inventory record. Technical capabilities, our ability to measure, to monitor, to even analyze that material, how well we can do that, that somewhat limits my knowledge of how well I know that is what they say it is. It's also time related, you know. My knowledge of Howard Hall, for instance, you know, 10 years ago is different than my knowledge of him today. He was at Livermore 10 years ago, but things have changed. Howard's not the same Howard he was completely. But time can affect how well you know what you
For which we were all grateful.
But time is a variable in our knowledge. Capabilities to monitor. You know, what's our current, past, and present capabilities to monitor this stuff. These are going to affect how well we know what we know. Now, these are some of the characteristics, data. When you measure something, we talk about terminology now called authenticated data, okay? Basically, that is trusted data. I need to know the data. If I've got a sensor on a cable and it's feeding in a computer, how do I know that data I see on that computer screen is coming from that sensor? And if you go in facilities that John's been in with the IEA, there may be miles of wires coming from sensors and systems. But if you can authenticate the data at the source, we have proven that you don't need to worry about the communication conduit in between. Now, a lot of our sensors and systems, including scales, aren't designed to authenticate data. This is stamping that data with a unique fingerprint that only the system on the other end can decrypt. You do this with your computers every day if you entrust or use programs like Pretty Good Privacy that's out in the public domain. But the other thing is, it's like having the DNA of that item. We have to authenticate equipment. How do we know that equipment that we see today is what we put in that facility? When we know that anything made by humans can be counterfeited by humans. So we have to build systems that take this thing in account. But we need uninterrupted, authenticated information, and we need to have this from a variety of sources to maintain continuity of knowledge of nuclear assets. Now, John mentioned that the foundation of safeguards is nuclear measurements and accounting. I'm kidding, because that has been the historic definition of what the primary function of a lot of safeguards is. The tools that are also been called complementary are called containment and surveillance systems. We're saying without both of these types of systems, you cannot build a bridge that maintains continuity of knowledge to draw effective safeguards conclusions. Now, containment and surveillance systems can be seals. If you measure something but don't seal it and walk away from it, how long can you trust what's in that container you measured still to be what's in that container? You've got to have both. Now, these have been called in the past because they came after this, which is fundamental. We got to do this too. But if you're going to walk away from the material and leave it for long periods of time, you've got to maintain a level of containment and surveillance. Is very important if you want to establish and maintain continuity of knowledge. Now, if you look at the fuel cycle today, you know, the part the IEA hasn't done much on is mining and milling. As John mentioned, they even started early at the end of conversion, but now they're covering all of conversion. Okay? But if I want to detect the undeclared better, and you go to a place like Australia, which supposedly has 20% of the world's uranium, and I'm not monitoring what's leaving mines or going places. Now they're doing forensics and some other things in some of these operations. But if I can't establish something on how many dump trucks go in and where they go, my ability possibly to detect undeclared activities with some of these materials can be limited. So extending some of the safeguards a little further in the fuel cycle might be one way to better detect undeclared activities. And that's what I said in that little bullet there. Now, when you monitor, and this is the only math I have in here, I promise. When you monitor something, everybody can build systems today that put out lots of data. More data than you need. I mean, we can take data in the nanosecond level and just fill up reams and reams of computer information. Now, years ago, the IEA used to put cameras in facilities and record video, continuous video, okay? Now, how did they analyze that? John, were you one of the guys that had to sit in the room and watch that, endless streams of video?
Reading manual, but they ran high speed.
Yeah. But all this data that you can generate, a lot of times is a data on a lot of nothing. But Nyquist, he came up with a theory that we use a lot in electrical engineering called sampling theory. Now, sampling theory tells us how much data we need to take to ensure we never miss an event. Now, if you watch television and you see an automobile, especially an automobile commercial, going down the road, does anybody know why the tires are spinning backwards? It's because the camera is not taking enough data. So it's missing events. So it's missing data to give you the true indication of what's really happening. That camera takes data as fast as our eye blinks at 1/30th of a second, typically. But what Nyquist says, if you look at the speed of that tire, how fast it's going, and you sample at least twice that frequency, you can guarantee you'll never miss an event. Now, how would we apply this to safeguards? Is if I have a monitor in a facility that's taking weight data from objects. Now, if these objects are static and not moving, you know, that may be one thing, but let's say they're in a storage vault and they're not moving. But what we do is a threat analysis or diversion analysis. How long would it take for me to take one of those items out and maybe put a bag of sand on that scale? Now, if you look at these threat scenarios, or what we sometimes call vulnerability assessments, Nyquist tells you if you believe your vulnerability assessment says it takes you an hour to swap that out. If you take data every half hour, they won't be able to do that to your system. Now, threat assessments are sometimes based on subject matter expert opinion, but what the beauty of Nyquist is it allows you to basically set a boundary of how fast you think you need to take data. And you can be a little more conservative if you want to, but at least it gives you a boundary of how much data you might need. And I think I kind of said that. There's no ideal sampling rate for any system. It's based on the threat that you may see. Now I'm going to get into quantum physics. I'm covering the spectrum here, but I'm going to make this simple. Back in the early 30s, quantum theory came out, and Einstein and Schrodinger designed a thought experiment. Einstein's was about unexploded gun powder, and his never caught on, but Schrodinger's did. In this thought experiment, they put a cat in a box. This cat was put in a box with a randomly decaying radioactive source that released a poison periodically. Then they closed the box. Now, quantum theory would say the cat is dead, or the cat is alive, or the cat is neither dead or alive. Okay? So if we put nuclear material in a container and close the box, as time passes, what do we know about that? What's in that box? Well, I won't get into alive or dead, but basically what they said is it would be in any of these states until you looked at it, and then it was either one or the other. That's what quantum theory says. But This is somewhat analogous to continuity of knowledge, where we have nuclear material, we put in a container, we weigh it, we measure it, we draw samples from it, we seal it up maybe, and we walk away from it. As time passes, what do we actually know about that material in the container? Well, I can tell you, we know what our adversaries can do. We know they might be able to take those seals off. We know they might be able to take some material out. They might be able to fool our measurement. So as time passes, how confident are we that that material in that container is still what we think it is? I know you guys think I'm going to the extreme, but do you know how much nuclear material a significant quantity is of uranium? 25 kgs. You know what size that represents? It's about the size of a softball or a grapefruit. Plutonium, what's a significant quantity of plutonium? 8 kgs, exactly. That's probably about the size of maybe a large tennis ball. So when people say these numbers volume-wise, they don't realize how little material this might be that could be used to make a weapon. Now, our goal of continuity of knowledge is to maintain a high level of knowledge on this material as best we can for as long as we can. We did an experiment with Sandia years ago on active sealing. What this represents is a material came in. This is with a passive seal system. A passive seal, we'll just say for references, is a piece of tape, tamper tape, we call it. This item came in, it was sealed, and it was measured, and we took destructive analysis data on it, and our knowledge based on this, this was a statistical model done by some Pam Dawson and some guys at Vandy for us, and they ran some code repetitively, kind of like a Monte Carlo analysis. But when our knowledge was high is when we first sealed that and measured it, and put that thing in inventory. Time passes, our knowledge or confidence of what it was decreased. We did, what they did was a confirmation. They went and did a seal check. So that stabilized it. And then some more time passed and it dropped, and then we went in and remeasured it a couple times, but you could see we had decreasing confidence that that thing was still what we thought it was. Then we modeled an active seal. This is a seal that's routinely checking itself, but also reporting its status, open or closed over the container. And we were able to keep our confidence or our continuity of knowledge that that item was still what we thought it was, high in this model. Now, this was based on some basic domestic types of material that was physically protected. So there were some things we took credit for in this that we can't in international. But it tells you how sometimes this sampling and monitoring is one way to maintain high continuity of knowledge on your nuclear assets. So, as I conclude here, I want you to know the future is now. A lot of these problems that exist today have been here for quite a while. The challenges are different, the tools are different, but the same basic underlying problem is somewhat the same. We need to do a better job with the undeclared. We need to do a better job dealing with non-state actors. And we also need for technologists to recognize what their role is. And I put a comment down here that technologists need to be able to articulate to the politicians and the policymakers what we know, what we do not know, and what we can't and what we can do, and also what we do not know and what is not even physically possible to do. Because sometimes I read things that I know are being proposed even by some of our laboratories that aren't possible in the situations that these materials exist. but it's important that we build that communication. So some things for you to think about. I think Ann mentioned the nuclear renaissance. It's not happening in this country at the moment. What does it do? Where is it going to happen? What kind of facilities and technologies might be involved? You know, the nuclear summit talked about a nuclear-free world, nuclear weapon-free world. What does that mean? I mean, what does it mean if we go to zero? I mean, things like yield and things start having to be negotiated. Can it be done? I don't know, but that's a challenge that I think will always be out there for a while. The threat of terrorism, non-state actors, you know, what can we do? You know, if we don't invest in the first line of defense, two, keeping the material at these facilities, can be very important to counter some of those activities. And what about collapsing of the non-proliferation regime? I mean, you know, as I mentioned before, politics are for the moment. These agreements go for a long time. How do you keep the politics and the political will to be engaged in this area? So in conclusion, I should have said 75 years, 62 years of the non-proliferation treaty years. It's actually 64 now. There's a lot of good reading out there. I also recommend a book by Richard Rhodes, The Twilight of the Bombs, if you guys are interested. But I like that book because there were a lot of people I worked with that were in there. But with that, I conclude and am willing to take questions if time permits.
We do have time for questions, so.
With regards to the MPCNA, do you think the recent U.S.-Russia disagreements will affect funding for that program, or is that hopefully beyond political tension?
It's all possible. We still have people going to Russia. I have 2 people in my group over there now, but their travel was approved, I was told, through the president's office. But like I said, politics can change rapidly. Did you have a question? Okay, thank you.